Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. And before we get into today's True Crime Tuesday, my name's Amber and I upload beauty and true crime content. If you're the type of videos that you like to watch, then why not hit that subscribe button and come along and join our little family. And if you're already part of the family, then make sure that notification bell is switched on just so you're notified of whenever I upload a video. I just like to do a warning. I do not mean any disrespect to anyone mentioned in this video. These videos do contain adult content and adult references. If that makes you feel uncomfortable in any way, that is fine. You can simply click off this video, and there are many others on my channel that will probably be suitable for you. I do want to add an extra warning in today's video that this is a particularly gruesome and grisly case that may make some people feel uncomfortable. Today's case is going to be a long case. There is so much information on this case, so you may want to go and grab yourself a cup of tea and sit down, get ready to listen, because there is a lot going on with this one. We're going to be doing another serial killer case, and today I'm going to be covering the case of Larry William Eyler, who was also known as the Highway Killer, who was believed to have murdered a minimum of 21 boys and young men. And these murders took place between the years of 1982 and 1984. He was known as the Interstate Killer or the Highway Killer due to the fact that many of his confirmed and alleged victims were discovered across several Midwestern states in the locations close to or accessible via the interstate highway system. Larry William Eyler was born on December 21st of 1952 in Crawfordsville, Indiana. He was the youngest of 4 children born to George Howard Eyler and Shirley Phyllis Kennedy. Larry's father George was an alcoholic, and he was very physically and emotionally abusive towards his family. Larry's parents did separate when he was just 2 years old. Larry, along with his younger sister, was often taken care of by foster families or a babysitter, or he was sometimes left in the care of his 2 older siblings, and his oldest sibling was only 10 years old. His mother Shirley did struggle to financially support her children or to provide adequate care for them. She did work 2 jobs, one as a waitress and one in a factory, and she did occasionally work in a bar on weekends. Larry attended St. Joseph's School in Lebanon, Indiana. He was tall for his age and very active in sporting activities, but he was often the target of bullies, and this was due to his upbringing because of his poor family background and the fact that his parents were divorced. Larry was well liked by his teachers, although described as being quiet, and he didn't have a lot of friends. In 1957, Shirley, Larry's mother, actually remarried, but this marriage only lasted a year before ending in divorce. Then she married for a 3rd time in 1960, but again, this marriage didn't last very long. It only lasted 4 years. Then that one ended in divorce. She married for a 4th time in 1972. Both Larry's father and his first 2 stepfathers were alcoholics, and this meant that his siblings and himself were often subjected to physical and emotional abuse, and one of his stepfathers actually frequently used to hold his head underneath scalding water as a form of discipline. Aged 10, Larry was actually placed in a home for unruly boys. His behaviour had just completely spiralled out of control, and it was getting too much for his mother Shirley. Larry found the experience very, very emotionally devastating to deal with, and he actually begged that his mum would let him come home. She did allow him to come home, but only on the condition that he would promise to improve his behaviour. So shortly after returning home, Larry did actually undergo a psychological evaluation at a guidance clinic. Psychological tests of Larry did reveal that he was of average intelligence, and he was actually suffering from severe insecurity. He had an extreme fear of separation and abandonment. The source of these presumed fears were his home life. Staff recommended that he temporarily be placed in a Catholic boys' home in Fort Wayne. Larry remained in this residence for 6 months before he returned home to the care of his mother. When he reached puberty, Larry actually discovered that he was homosexual. He was only open about his sexuality to his family though. He struggled with deep-seated feelings of self-hatred regarding his sexual preference. Throughout high school, he did occasionally date girls, but none of these relationships ever became physical. Larry failed to graduate from high school, although he did later obtain a general educational development certificate. So after leaving college, Larry actually got himself a job as a private security guard in the Marion County General Hospital. This position only lasted 6 months and he actually lost the job. So this meant that he had to seek alternative employment, which he did so, and he ended up working at a shoe store. Larry began to familiarise himself with Indianapolis's gay community. He frequently visited gay bars and often engaged in casual liaisons with men. Several of the men that he had liaisons with did come out to say that he did avert his eyes during sexual intercourse, and he would shout profanities at them, such as calling them a bitch or a whore. It led many to believe that he was actually fantasising that his partner was female rather than male. By the mid-1970s, Larry was actually well known within the gay community of Indianapolis, particularly to those with a leather fetish. Members of the community described him as being a good-looking, laid-back guy. He was an avid bodybuilder. He was close to his sister and mother. Others who engaged in sexual activity with him actually described him in a very different way, and they said that he had a sadistic streak, he had a violent temper, which would only surface during sexual encounters, which often involved Larry extensively bludgeoning them and inflicting light knife wounds upon his unwilling partners, particularly to their torsos. Larry primarily worked as a house painter. He lived in a condominium in Terre Haute with a 38-year-old library professor named Robert David Little, who he first met in 1974 while studying at the Indiana State University. The relationship between the two men was more of like a platonic one, and Larry viewed Robert more as like a father figure. The two regularly did, however, socialise together within Indiana's gay community. Larry would frequently bring young men home where they both lived to engage in sexual acts together. On August 3rd of 1978, Larry actually picked up a 19-year-old hitchhiker named Craig Long on 7th Street in Terre Haute. Larry made sexual advances toward Craig, who then attempted to leave the vehicle. Larry then pressed a knife against his chest and ordered him to undress, handcuffing him, binding his ankles and telling him to get into the back of the truck. Craig attempted to flee from the vehicle as Larry was undressing himself. Larry stabbed him once in the chest and penetrated his lung. Craig then thought it would be a smart move to sort of just slump to the floor and pretend that he was dead, and then he decided he was going to stumble towards a nearby occupied house, and the occupants called paramedics to help him. Shortly after this, Larry actually drove past the house where Craig was, and he actually offered the sheriff the key to the handcuffs that Craig was in, and he said that he'd actually stabbed Craig accidentally. So he was then immediately arrested and taken into custody. A search of his vehicle actually recovered a hunting knife, a metal tipped whip, a butcher knife, a further set of handcuffs, tear gas and a sword. Larry was then charged with aggravated battery, to which he agreed to plead guilty. A judge set his bond at $10,000 and the sum was then raised by his friends. He was released on bail until August 23rd. On this date, Larry's lawyers offered Craig a cheque from Robert Little for $2,500 in return for agreeing not to press charge. Craig accepted the offer and Larry changed his plea to not guilty. As such, he was acquitted on November 13th, being fined only $43 in court costs. It really annoys me with these cases when you're like, you had him. And I know they don't know that, but like, this guy then went on to commit like 20 murders. Oh, it's so irritating. So in August 1981, Larry formed a long-term relationship with a 20-year-old married man who was called John Dabrowski, and Dabrowski lived with his wife, 2 children and 3 foster children in Chicago, Illinois. His wife Sally was actually fully aware of her husband's sexual preference. Both Larry and Dabrowski held a pendant for masochism. So if you don't know what masochism is, it is the tendency to derive sexual gratification from one's own pain or humiliation. Their sexual activity frequently involved Larry binding his partner to devices before proceeding to beat and lash him as he hurled curses before the two engaged in penetrative sex. Neither Larry nor Dabrowski was inclined towards monogamy, although the couple did consider their relationship a permanent one. Larry did constantly seek reassurance that he was the only man in Dabrowski's life. Larry would often accuse Dabrowski of cheating on him, so this would lead to arguments, and the arguments would actually lead to Dabrowski striking Larry, although he never retaliated in these situations. Occasionally the couple's arguments were actually initiated by the perceptions of Robert Little, and this was because Robert actually resented Dabrowski and Larry and the fact that they were in a long-term relationship. So on October 12th of 1982, Larry lured 21-year-old Craig Townsend into his vehicle in Crown Point, Indiana. He was drugged, extensively beaten and later abandoned and comatose in a rural field. He also suffered from exposure but luckily survived the attack. 11 days later, on October 23rd of 1982, Larry abducted and murdered 19-year-old Stephen Crockett. His body was discovered in a cornfield in Kankakee County approximately 12 hours after his murder. An autopsy revealed he had been beaten, then stabbed to death, suffering 32 knife wounds, including 4 to his head. A week later, on October 30th of 1982, 26-year-old named Edgar Underkoffler disappeared from Rantoul, Illinois. His body was not discovered until March of 1983 in a field close to Danville, Illinois. The following month, Larry murdered a 25-year-old barman named John Johnson. His body was discovered 1 month later in Lowell, Indiana. On December 19th, a 23-year-old named Stephen Egan was abducted in Terre Haute. His body was discovered in woodland close to Indiana State Road 63 on December 28th. An outbuilding on an abandoned farm was examined, which was close to where Stephen's body was found. The outbuilding revealed traces of human flesh on the walls in areas where the plaster had been damaged. Investigators speculated that Stephen had been suspended against the walls of this property. Stephen had extensive mutilation to his abdomen, chest and throat. The coroner who performed the autopsy stated that the person who did this had exhibited tremendous rage. Immediately after concluding Stephen's autopsy, he conducted an autopsy upon the body of a 21-year-old named John Roach, whose body had been found close to Interstate 70 in Putnam County that day. He noted striking similarities in injuries inflicted upon John Roach and Stephen Egan, again noting multiple stab wounds to the victim's abdomen, upper chest and throat, suggesting an overt rage exhibited by the perpetrator. On December 30th, 22-year-old Yale University graduate David Block disappeared from an Illinois suburb of Highland Park, having told his family of his intentions to visit a friend in the nearby city of Highwood. His body was discovered by a farmer in a field south of Illinois on Route 173 on May 7th of 1984. On January 24th of 1983, Larry abducted and murdered a 16-year-old named Irvin Gibson in Lake County. His body was not discovered until April 15th, discarded atop a body of a dog which had also been stabbed to death. On May 9th, the body of 21-year-old Daniel Scott McNevey was discovered in a field close to Indiana State Road in Hendricks County. He had suffered 11 knife wounds to his neck, 5 to his back and 11 to his abdomen, with 1 wound causing small sections of his intestine to protrude through his abdomen. Welt marks were discovered on Daniel's wrist and ankles, and his jeans had been pulled down to his ankles. As with other victims, his body bore no signs of being subject to sexual assault. 9 days later, Larry murdered a 25-year-old named Richard Bruce in Effingham, Illinois. His body was thrown from a bridge into a creek and remained undiscovered until December 5th. Police began to routinely raid gay bars and bookstores, in addition to continually overtly filming patrons. They were trying to identify any suspect. By spring of 1983, police in Indiana had definitely linked several murders of young males to the same perpetrator. 6 days after the discovery of Daniel McNevey's body, the Indiana State Police conducted a meeting attended by 35 detectives from each of the 4 jurisdictions where bodies had been found. Detectives concluded that the same individual had committed the murders in each jurisdiction, and then all the investigators came together and they decided that they were going to form a task force dedicated to apprehending the suspect. On the first day of the team's existence, the task force decided they were going to contact the FBI. So they described the method in which the victims were murdered and the way the bodies were disposed of. They were seeking information from any police force who had discovered young male victims with wounds that matched this pattern to contact them, because they were trying to link any more cases together. Investigators in Lexington, Kentucky contacted the task force, reporting that a 29-year-old named Jay Reynolds had been discovered stabbed to death in their jurisdiction on March 22nd. Days later, investigators in Chicago reported that the body of an 18-year-old African-American teenager named Jimmy Roberts had been found with 35 stab wounds to the body in Thorn Creek on May 9th. Both victims were linked to the manhunt for the same perpetrator, whom the task force deemed the highway murderer. On June 6th of 1983, Thomas Henderson, Larry's former lover, actually phoned the police's confidential hotline to voice his suspicions that he felt like Larry could have been the murderer. He informed them that Larry had been charged with the stabbing of a young hitchhiker in 1978. He possessed a violent temper. He had a penchant for bondage. He also informed investigators that in 1984, Larry Larry had drugged a 14-year-old boy, then he abandoned him in a woodland close to Greencastle. The boy had not been molested, and investigators theorised that the reason that Larry had given the boys the pills was as a means to test the effectiveness of the sedative. After running a background check on Larry, they discovered that he had been arrested in 1978. Larry was known to regularly travel between Indianapolis and Chicago. This information was considered sufficient enough to keep an informal track on his whereabouts, but they were not able to place him under full surveillance. The FBI created a psychological profile for the unknown killer. They predicted that he was a white male in his 20s or early 30s. He worked in a menial profession. He had a rough exterior in part due to his self-hatred regarding his sexual attraction to other males. He would also be fearful of being labelled by others as queer, and that this individual likely had a middle-aged, middle-class and markedly more intelligent accomplice in several of his initial homicides. On August 31st of 1983, a tree trimming crew discovered the body of 28-year-old Ralph Carlisle in a field close to the tollway near Illinois Route 60. He had been stabbed 17 times with a butcher or hunting knife, with several wounds inflicted to his abdomen, causing small sections of his intestine to protrude through his body. Lake County investigators quickly linked this murder to the deaths of two other men whose body had been discovered close to this victim earlier in 1983, Irvin Gibson and Gustavo Herrera. 1 month later, on October 4th of 1983, two mushroom hunters discovered a human torso inside a plastic bag in Kenosha County, Wisconsin. The victim was identified as 18-year-old Eric Hansen, who had last been seen alive on September 27th in St. Francis. Eric's head, arms and legs had been severed from the torso with a hacksaw, and the torso itself had been completely drained of blood. The skull and hands were never found. 11 days later, the skeletonized body of an unidentified young man was discovered buried in a field close to Rensselaer, Indiana. The victim was determined to be Caucasian with shoulder-length reddish-brown hair and around 18 to 26, although his identity was never discovered. On October 18th, the partially decomposed bodies of 4 further victims were discovered alongside an oak tree to an abandoned farmhouse in Lake Village, Indiana. Each victim had been deceased for several months, and all 4 had been partially buried, with sections of the body of each victim remaining exposed above ground. 3 of the victims were buried at one side of the tree, 3 feet apart, with their head facing north. A 4th victim, an unidentified African American, estimated to be between 15 and 18, was buried at the other side of the trees. All 4 victims had been stabbed more than 24 times, and the trousers of each victim were discovered around their ankles. 2 months later, on December 7th, a hunter discovered the partially buried skeleton of 17-year-old Richard Wayne in Hendricks County, close to US Route 40. He had disappeared on March 20th while travelling from California to his home in Montpelier, Indiana. The body of the second victim was discovered beneath the remnants of a burned mobile home, a few feet from where Richard had been buried. He was determined to be African American, approximately 5'9", although his remains have never been identified. On September 30th, police actually arrested Larry in Lowell, Indiana, for a routine traffic violation. He was in the company of a young hitchhiker at the time, and men were then arrested and detained for questioning. Larry was detained at a Lowell State Police post on charges of soliciting a young male for sexual purposes, and Sergeant William Cothran searched Larry's Ford F-Series pickup at the roadside before informing him he was under arrest, but he did search the vehicle without consent. At 1:30, investigators conducted a formal interview with Larry. They informed him that he was a suspect in a series of murders. He consented to the investigators' request to conduct a forensic examination of his vehicle, and also agreed to allow investigators to take his mugshot, copies of his fingerprints, and subject him to a polygraph test on a later day. A search of Larry's vehicle recovered a knife, 2 sections of nylon rope, handcuffs, a hammer, 2 baseball bats, a mallet and surgical tape. An inspection of his footwear and vehicle revealed the impressions of his boots to be a precise match to the plaster casts taken of the imprints discovered alongside the body of Robert Carlisle. The pattern of his vehicle tyre tracks were also deemed similar. Moreover, blood was discovered beneath the handle of a knife found inside the vehicle, and Larry was known to have regularly commuted between the 3 districts in Indiana and Illinois where several victims' bodies had been discovered. Larry's lifestyle closely matched the predicted psychological profile that the FBI had compiled. Upon completion of the forensic examination of Larry's pickup, Indiana investigators informed him that he was free to leave custody and retain possession of his vehicle. Police had growing concerns that Larry may then try to dispose of evidence. Now, he had knowledge that he was a murder suspect. So on October 1st, they actually obtained a search warrant to search Robert Little's Terre Haute home. The search was conducted on October 3rd. Circumstantial evidence was found, including credit card receipts indicating Larry's presence in jurisdictions where bodies had been found. They'd also examined phone bills that were retrieved from the property, and Larry had often called Robert at antisocial hours, and shortly after the victims were believed to have been murdered. One of these calls had been placed from a payphone near Cook County Hospital on April 8th, the murder date of the victim, Gustavo Herrera. Larry accompanied investigators for further questioning. He denied the tyre tracks and boot impressions recovered at the murder scene belonged to him, and he said that he'd never met the victim. Shortly after his release from custody on October 4th, Larry requested legal representation from a Chicago lawyer named Kenneth Dikowski. Investigators had insufficient evidence to formally charge his client with murder, leading Dikowski to actually file a civil suit against both Lake County Sheriff's Police Office and the Indiana State Police on October 11th, citing that his client had been harassed. This suit sought $250,000 in damages against 11 named officers in both states. On October 6th, the boot and tyre imprints recovered at the murder scene of Ralph Carlisle were sent to the headquarters of the FBI for further analysis. The FBI reported that the boot impressions were a precise match. There were 4 distinctive areas of the boots and damage to the soles that just meant there was no way that it couldn't be a match. Extensive blood stains determined to be a type A positive were also discovered inside the footwear. Furthermore, the tyres upon Larry's vehicle were from 2 separate manufacturers, and the physical impressions recovered from the murder scene were determined to be from 2 separate manufacturers. The tyre impressions themselves were a perfect match in terms of the grip depth. On October 29, Dominski's civil suit was heard. As Larry walked from his hearing, 2 Lake County investigators presented Dikowski with the warrant authorising their retrieval of Larry's blood and hair sample. A sample of Larry's blood revealed his blood type to be O positive, so different to the blood type that was found under the knife. Larry was formally charged with Ralph Carlisle's murder on October 29th, with the bond being set at $1 million. An initial trial date was set for December 19th, but Larry did protest his innocence. On November 1st, investigators obtained a search warrant to conduct a second search of Robert Little's home. The primary purpose of this search warrant was to determine whether or not victims' missing t-shirts and wallets had been retained as keepsakes. Although investigators retrieved 221 items of clothing, jewellery, pharmaceuticals, Polaroid photographs, none of them recovered belonged to any of the murder victims. A criminal defence attorney named David Shippers was appointed to replace Kenneth Dikowski on Larry's legal representative on November 12th. Following a lengthy evidentiary hearing in December 1983, a Lake County Circuit judge named William Block ruled that although Larry's initial arrest for the traffic violation had been legally valid, his subsequent detainment, during which the evidence was recovered by the Indiana police, had been obtained without probable cause, and as such his detention had been illegal. On February 1st, 1984, Judge Block ruled the physical evidence recovered by Illinois investigators in their comparison of his boot prints and tyre tracks to the plaster cast recovered at the crime scene had been tainted, as this search had been prompted by Larry's initial illegal detainment by Indiana investigators in violation of his rights. So in other words, they're Tom ducked because they can't use the evidence. Further ruled that the facts detailed in the police affidavit to search Robert Little's home were insufficient enough to warrant a search. With the exception of the tyre impressions, hair and blood samples obtained from Larry, he actually ordered that all evidence obtained to be suppressed. Block also reduced bond sum to $10,000. Larry was then freed from custody on the February 6th of 1984. His family and Robert Little paid the reduced bond fee, and the only thing that his bond stipulated was that he could not leave Illinois. In attempts to appeal the ruling, prosecutors submitted several legal challenges, including an appeal against the suppression of the evidence to the Supreme Court of the United States. All of the appeals were unsuccessful, so in other words, that evidence, they can't use it. Larry permanently relocated to Chicago. He resided in an apartment complex in Rogers Lane with Robert Little. At approximately 10:30 on August 19th of 1984, Larry lured 16-year-old Daniel Bridges to his apartment. The youngest of 13 children, Daniel was actually very neglected. He was a runaway, and although he was a heterosexual male, he had been a prostitute since he was the age of 12. Inside Larry's apartment, Daniel was bound bound to a chair with a clothesline before being beaten, tortured and stabbed to death. Daniel was dismembered. His body was cut into 8 pieces, each which were completely drained of blood before they were placed inside 6 separate plastic bags. The dismembered body of Daniel Bridges was discovered by a janitor named Joseph Barler on the morning of August 21st of 1984. His remains had been placed inside a garbage dumpster close to Larry's apartment. Believing the bags had been fly tipped, he chose to remove the bags from the garbage and he opened them up to inspect the content. When he removed the first bag from the disposal unit, it actually split open and revealed a human severed leg. Barler reported this to police and he actually told police that he had seen Larry Eyler dumping the bag. Immediately police recognised the name and police arrested him along with John Dubrovsky, who was also in the apartment at the time, although he was soon released without charge. A forensic examination of Larry's apartment conducted between August 21st and 22nd revealed that there was copious quantities of blood that had recently been cleaned from the bedroom, which had evidently been recently repainted. Though extensive traces of blood spattering were located across the floor, walls and ceiling, numerous traces of blood later determined that it belonged to Daniel Bridges. There was also blood discovered upon a mattress, the seat of a chair, a leather belt, a sofa within his room and beneath the floorboards of the doorway to the bathroom. Inside Larry's closet, investigators discovered the victim's jeans saturated with blood stains. Distinctive Duke University t-shirt was also extensively blood-stained and was discovered in a hamper, and a leather vest belonging to Larry had been evidently washed. Moreover, investigators discovered a hacksaw within the property, blades for this tool plus an owl. It's AWL, it's like a little picking tool. Receipts recovered from the property revealed Larry had recently purchased several hacksaw blades. The forensic examination of the bags used to conceal the remains revealed several fingerprints determined to belong to Larry. On the 24th of August, investigators conducted an luminol test inside Larry's now empty apartment. The test revealed extensive traces of blood spillage in the bedroom. Further markings across the floor indicated the body had been dragged from the bedroom into a bathtub where the teenager's body was evidently dismembered. On August 22nd, Larry was formally charged with the murder of Daniel Bridges. He denied any knowledge in the crime. The autopsy determined that his death had been caused due to multiple wounds inflicted with a knife and an owl-like instrument. No facial fractures were evident, although the teenager had evidently been beaten around the right eye. There was also shallow cuts to his face before his death. 14 wounds likely inflicted with an ice pick or owl were also evident upon and around his sternum. These wounds had also been inflicted prior to death. There were 5 knife wounds to the abdomen which were marked deep and they had caused sections of the intestine to protrude through the wounds. 3 additional wounds to the teenager's back had been inflicted with such force the heart and left lung had been perforated. Larry was brought to trial for aggravated kidnapping, unlawful restraint, murder and concealment of the body of Daniel Bridges on the July 1st of 1986. He was tried in Cook County, Illinois before Judge Joseph Erzo and chose to enter a formal plea of not guilty against his charges. The jury deliberated for just 3 hours before returning with a verdict and they found Larry guilty of all charges. On October 3rd of 1986, Larry was actually sentenced to death by lethal injection. An initial execution date was set for March 14th of 1990. Following his sentencing, he was transferred to the Pontiac Correctional Centre, where he remained incarcerated on death row. Within the facility, he underwent several psychiatric evaluations. These tests concluded that Larry was actually suffering from borderline personality disorder. He had pathological sensitivity to feelings of abandonment. Experts theorised that he had killed in response to the real or perceived feelings of rejection from his lover, discharging his rage upon his victims. Furthermore, these experts also believed that he had murdered them in order to gain control. In May of 1988, Larry filed a formal appeal against his conviction. He actually come forward to say that Robert Little had actually committed this murder, not him. He just helped Robert dispose of the body. The appeal was heard on May 10th of 1989, but it was dismissed on October 25th. In November of 1990, a Vermilion County prosecutor named Larry Thomas obtained the physical evidence obtained against Larry in relation to the murder of Ralph Carlisle, which was ordered to be suppressed by Judge William Block, with the view of presenting the evidence before an Indiana grand jury to determine whether sufficient evidence existed to charge him with the December 1982 murder of Stephen Egan. Upon being informed of his impeding indictment in Stephen Egan's murder, he agreed to voluntarily confess, although he insisted that this particular murder had been committed committed with the help of Robert Little. He agreed to confess to his guilt and testify against his alleged accomplice on the condition he would be given a fixed term of imprisonment as opposed to a further death sentence. His offer was accepted and Larry was provided with an attorney. On December 13th, Larry pleaded guilty to the murder of Stephen Egan, and he testified that Robert Little had knowingly been a willing participant in the murder. He received a sentence of 60 years imprisonment on December 28th to be served concurrently with his existing sentence. Kathleen Zellner was hired to then represent Larry, and she actually tried to offer a deal where he would basically confess to 20 other further homicides across 10 counties in Illinois and Indiana if the state in Illinois would commute his death sentence to one of life imprisonment. The Cook County State Attorney Jack O'Malley rejected this offer. Robert Little was actually brought to trial, and he was brought to trial on April 11th of 1991, and he entered a formal plea of not guilty. Larry testified against his alleged accomplice, claiming that both Robert and him had participated in the murder of Stephen Egan. After deliberating for over 7 hours, the jury found Robert not guilty on all charges. Larry Eyler died in the infirmary of the Pontiac Correctional Centre on March 6th of 1994. His death was AIDS-related due to AIDS-related complications. He had been seriously ill for approximately 10 days before his death. 2 days after Larry's death, Kathleen Zellner called a press conference in which she revealed the names and/or descriptions of 17 individuals who her client had confessed to murdering. Her client had been an emotionally insecure individual who had viewed Robert Little as something of a father figure, and this was something that he'd never had in his life, so it left him very, very vulnerable to manipulation. And he said that Robert used him as a means of facilitating these young boys, and he also in return provided him with financial support. In the confession that came out after his death, Larry did state that he typically lured his victims, who had been both heterosexual and homosexual, with premises of drugs, alcohol, money or transport. Larry claimed he had never engaged in sex with any of his victims, and he had frequently given the t-shirts of his victims to Robert Little. So with his health in gradual decline, he actually authorised his attorney to publicly release the confessions after his death, with his explanation being that the families of his victims would know he had confessed to the murders of their sons and brothers. His confession revealed that he had murdered 21 teenage boys and young men between 1982 and 1984, with the alleged assistance of Robert Little in 4 of these murders. He denied any culpability in the physical murder of Daniel Bridges, although he did admit that he did dismember the body. Police strongly believe that Larry is also responsible for 2 further homicides committed in Wisconsin and Kentucky in 1983. He confessed to committing the murders as a means of relieving frustration and as they were like an act of relief for him. His victims were hitchhikers, male prostitutes or individuals he had generally encountered by hapstance. He'd also admitted to killing a uptown male prostitute known as the Cowboy. He was killed in his Rogers Park apartment in 1984, but his body has never been found. Larry did not confess to the murders of Jay Reynolds or Eric Hansen, but he is still considered a strong suspect in both homicides. 6 of his victims actually still remain unidentified, the body of one whom has never been found. Shortly after his 1991 acquittal for the murder of Stephen Egan, Robert Little returned to teaching. He continued to maintain his lack of knowledge and innocence in the murders that Larry had committed. Wow, where do I start? Right, okay, wow, isn't this guy a piece of work? Oh my god, this guy. It's like they had him and they let him go, and it's so annoying, and it's like I don't really know what to say in terms of Larry. Like, he is just a piece of work, and I'm happy he come forward and confessed and said who he'd murdered and like identified the victims, because at least the families know what happened. It's just a shame for those bodies that do still remain unidentified. I'm not sure about Robert Little though, guys. I do not know whether I believe he did have a little bit of involvement in it. I don't know. It's very, very suspicious to me. I strongly believe Larry was the main mastermind, but I don't know whether Robert had possibly helped him clean up on several occasions. I'm very suspicious of it. Very suspicious of that situation. I would love to know what you think of this case. Let me know all of your theories, your thoughts, your feelings down below. I'm just so glad he was caught and he was put behind bars eventually, and I just hope and pray for the families that they now have found some sort of a peace. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you in the next video.